Now, many people have their ideas of Japan during World War II based mostly off movies about the war and an HBO miniseries or two, as well as a lot of folk legend that's been passed down through the years. However, a lot of this has given us a rather confused picture of how things actually were. A lot of people think that Japan during that era was people worshipping a godlike emperor and they were happy to throw away their lives in a suicide attack in his glorious name. The truth is a lot more human, as things usually are with human beings. Number 10. People did believe that Hirohito was divine, but that does not make him a god. Many people think the Japanese emperor was considered a god and renounced this at the end of the war, but the concept of the divinity of the emperor is a lot more complicated than most people think. The emperor did claim to be distantly descended from the Shinto god Amaterasu, but he never claimed to be an actual god, nor did the Japanese people claim such for him. The other major misconception is that the emperor ever renounced his divinity at all. His statement was interpreted that way by Westerners, but his intent was actually to point out that, unlike what we were claiming, Japan had actually been democratic to at least some extent since the Meiji era. Further, the emperor was not divine in terms of absolute rule, but was in terms of his responsibility to perform rituals and functions that kept the Shinto gods watching over Japan. Number 9. Kamikaze pilots were hardly the willing sacrificial cows that people tend to think. One of the most enduring legends of World War II are the kamikaze pilots of Japan. The stories have taken such a hold in popular imagination that people tend to think of Japanese people as more suicidal. Regardless, it is a commonly held belief that these pilots were happily going to their deaths, willingly sacrificial cows who signed up to die for their divine emperor. However, the truth is way more human. The Japanese authorities knew that no sane man would really volunteer for a suicide mission, especially considering none of these tended to be missions of particularly great singular importance in the grand scheme of things. So most pilots who were going to go on suicide missions were actually recruited for it at the last minute and briefed almost right before. In some cases they weren't forced to go, but considering the patriotism of war, it was very hard for them to say no. Number 8. The Japanese army may have surrendered because of Stalin and not the bomb. One of the favorite moral debates and long-held controversies is the use of the atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The usual justification is that the Japanese simply would not have surrendered otherwise, and that it was the only way to end the war without literally killing every single Japanese person on the island. However, the truth is that many historians now believe that the entire thing was actually unnecessary, and basically all those people were killed for no good reason. Like we said, the justification was always that it was the only way to end the war, but many scholars say that the war was about to end anyway, and that the Japanese surrender didn't really have anything to do with the atomic bomb in the first place. The real reason why the Japanese were about to surrender was because the Germans had been beaten and Stalin was about to open up another front against the Japanese and bring his considerable weight to bear against them. With the beating they were already taking, Stalin coming in to throw his weight around was just too much, and they knew it. Number 7. The United States tends to forget other countries' major roles against the Japanese army. American movies tend to always focus on the role of their own people, so sometimes people forget just how major a role other countries played in the Pacific Theater, helping the United States against the Japanese army. One country who is still rather peeved about their contribution not being noticed is China, who sacrificed greatly during World War II and suffered horribly at the hands of the Japanese, having many of their people slaughtered, tortured, and experimented on. Their resistance in China was crucial to the war effort in the Pacific Theater. Another country that many forget about are Australians, who provided fierce resistance during World War II against the Japanese and were important in providing staging grounds for the Allies. While the United States tended to be largely responsible for the most aggressive moves towards the enemy, the Australian contributions on islands like Papua New Guinea, New Britain and others put up yet one more ferocious front of resistance against the fierce and well-organized Japanese army. Roughly 40,000 Australians died in the war effort, and nearly 1/7 of the entire population was involved in some way or another. Number 6. Many people forget the slow build-up to Pearl Harbor or the reasons for the attack. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it was a shock to the core of the United States of America. Even though it was essentially a military target, it was technically on US soil, and it was the first time such an incident had occurred in modern United States history. Most Americans were blindsided and could hardly believe what had happened, but the truth was that even civilians who had been watching could have likely seen this coming from a long ways off. The build-up to Pearl Harbor was over the course of a good decade or so as the Japanese continued to try to expand their territory and their holdings. Therefore, the United States felt the need to slow them down or stop them entirely. To this end, the United States applied sanctions of various sorts against Japan over the years, increasing the tension but not really resolving anything. The Japanese wanted to aggressively take territory, but the Americans were the biggest thorn in their side, and they knew how dangerous the Americans were. Their goal was to cut off American supply abilities at the knee so they could gain momentum before the US would stop them. Because of this, they knew that they had to act extremely fast, and therefore, Pearl Harbor. Number 5. Japan's strategy may have been well calculated, but some in leadership had misgivings. While Pearl Harbor may have been an extremely calculated move against a military target, it was also an incredibly risky strategy, and some in the Japanese leadership knew it and even voiced their misgivings, but they were ultimately ignored. Admiral Isoroku, the man in charge of the Japanese Navy during World War II, felt from the start that this entire outlook was grim, and while he obeyed orders as a soldier and worked to the best of his abilities, he was not hopeful. Admiral Isoroku was worried that Japan's cities, which were densely packed, populated, and made mostly of flammable material, would be susceptible to major air raids. This part proved incredibly prescient as General Curtis LeMay's bombing raids leveled a huge portion of Japan's infrastructure and slaughtered countless innocent people. He was also worried that Japan's economy would not be able to sustain itself during a long war and that they had a very short time to win. Pearl Harbor was supposed to give them a huge head start, otherwise they'd have had no chance at all. Number 4. It may surprise some Americans that in Japan the non-atomic bombs are often forgotten. In the USA, a lot of time is spent commemorating various wars and other patriotic events, and there are a lot of holidays about them. Arguably, there are at least 3 that center entirely around events regarding war, and they are all official holidays: Veterans Day, Memorial Day, and the 4th of July. Therefore, many Americans would think that all the various bombings and air raids conducted against them would be acknowledged in some way by the Japanese government and commemorated as a sad or solemn event of some kind, especially something as serious as the firebombing of the city of Tokyo. However, these events have been largely ignored, and the Japanese activists who try to bring light to these events find resistance. The authorities feel that some of the material released or too much acknowledgement of what happened could make the Japanese government from the time period look bad for not entering the war earlier when their citizens were suffering so horribly from such horrific raids. The other issue is that there has been little momentum over the years to talk more about the firebombing raids because everyone was enthralled by the power of the atomic bomb and wanted to talk about nothing else. Number 3. The Japanese did not just take the bombing of Tokyo, they punished innocent Chinese. After the Doolittle raid, the first attack on Tokyo shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were furious and wanted immediate revenge. However, the American mainland was a long way away, and the Japanese wanted to get revenge now. Well, as it turns out, the Doolittle raid was basically a one-way trip, and the pilots needed to land in China in order to survive. The American government even feared that the Japanese would retaliate brutally and that the Chinese military would not be able to stop them, but the government, they went through with the raid anyway, and the airmen happily accepted the Chinese help that they were being offered when they landed. They even gave gifts and other trinkets in honest thanks. Unfortunately, the entire thing, it soon became a nightmare. The Japanese not only wanted to get revenge, but more strategically, they realized that this was a major vulnerability. They went on a massive sweep through the eastern coast of China, razing villages to the ground, slaughtering countless civilians, and raping women. Those who were found to have directly aided and abetted the American airmen were singled out for particularly humiliating and gruesome torture. The trinkets they had been given in thanks now giving them away as helpful post-conspirators in the Doolittle raid. Number 2. Many people don't realize that the Japanese did not respect all of their enemies equally. As we mentioned in the previous entry, the Japanese decided that since they couldn't reach the US mainland, the closest vulnerable ally was the best place to punish. Some people believe that the Japanese punished the Chinese, though, because they feared even worse United States and Western retaliation if they did the worst things they did against the Chinese against Westerners. The Japanese singled out the Chinese people for the very worst experiments from their notorious Unit 731, but that was only the beginning of their biological attacks against the enemy that they respected the least. The Japanese infected the food supplies of many villages they raided, and they deliberately infected fleas with the bubonic plague over Chinese villages as an attempt and an experiment at biological warfare. Recently, Japanese courts ruled that the government during World War II did indeed order and authorize such things. However, despite the court repudiating the Japanese government's continued denials, they also stated that under Japanese law and international agreements, the Japanese government does not have to pay anything to living victims or their families. As far as the authorities are concerned, any reparations for anything regarding the war have already been paid by Japan, with agreements made at the end of the war, and it is all over and done with. Number 1. Many people think Pearl Harbor was as close as they got to America, but this isn't actually so. Most people think that the Japanese only ever got as far as Pearl Harbor, but there were occasions where they actually struck a little closer to the mainland, although not severely enough that most people remember much about either incident. In 1942, a Japanese submarine patrolling off the coast of Los Angeles near Santa Barbara damaged an oil well on Elwood Beach before making its escape. However, the stranger attempts by the Japanese to get control of the mainland were their fire balloons. The Japanese were getting desperate and willing to try anything against the United States in 1944, so they launched about 9,000 fire balloons, which were balloons meant to float across the ocean and deliver an incendiary payload onto the mainland US, hopefully over an area where fire would spread easily. A few hundred made it across the ocean, but most of these were simply shot down. People in 15 states did report seeing them, but the design was clearly not great, as an incident where a balloon exploded not long after ended up killing a pregnant woman and 5 children, and this was the only time any of their balloons actually worked. It is also the only official recorded incident where someone was hurt on United States soil during World War II by an attack from a declared enemy. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. And if you want more stuff from me, I've got another channel with daily videos. It's called Today I Found Out. I'm linking to that below as well as on the screen now. And as always, thank you for watching.